Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And this week on the show, we have a very special guest. Back once again. Guest host, really. You're not just a guest anymore. You're kind of a guest host.
Friend of the Personality Hacker family.
That's right. So Christian Rivera is here. Both our media producer, art director, and often co-host guest that comes on the show to share ideas and things with us. So welcome, Christian. We're glad you're with us today.
Thank you. It's very exciting. This gives me life. And I'm just so excited to do this with you guys.
You're always the guy behind the camera doing the editing. You come to our live events and you're often with your production team helping shoot and record things. And I try to get you up here to talk as much as I can. We were in Gettysburg last year. We had you come up and share a few things about being an INTP, some advice you had. And I think it's really valuable to have you on the show. You've been in production for a long time. And again, I value your perspective as an INTP with INTP preferences. And I think it's cool to have you here.
I appreciate that. I think it's fun to be a part of the creative process and helping with producing podcast episode ideas. And we talk a lot about big old theories and trying to distill them into ways that we could put this into a 45-minute whatever. So we're going to try to do that again today.
Yeah. So we were in town. You were in town because we've been running our Personality Life Path program. And this past weekend was our big 3-day culmination of that. It's an 8-week program where we go through all 8 of the Jungian cognitive functions. We help people see the archetypal energy in the world, in their lives, in their personality. And it was huge. And you actually went through some of it too, as this time around, the cycle around, because you wanted to do some personal growth stuff.
Yep.
So we're kind of on a high and you're here in town. And we thought there's been a book that yourself, myself, and Antonia have been really tuned into lately. So we thought, well, while you're still in town before you fly home tomorrow, why don't we sit down and record a little bit of content? Now, a year ago, at the time of this recording, however many episodes that is, like 50-ish episodes or so, we talked about generational theory. You were on the show to talk about the different generations and the generational shadows of generations. I thought that was a fantastic conversation. And I think it was a 2-part episode series.
Yeah, we broke it into Millennials and Gen Z. Yeah. And then we did Boomers and Gen X to kind of, there was some pairings there with each of them that had some, maybe similar neuroses that were worth kind of talking about.
Absolutely. So if you're listening or watching right now, you should go and check that out. I think that's a really great conversation we had. But the author of the generational theory system that we use, Neil Howe, also Bill Strauss, who passed away. Neil Howe just came out with a new book in like the last couple months. I'm a little behind the time. You and Antonia have already finished it. I'm like maybe a third of the way in.
Yeah, we plowed through it.
I keep trying to find time, but I have to do things, guys. I don't know how where you get all this free time to be reading, but I got stuff to do. Anyway, the point is that you guys have both finished it, which actually I can feature what I can't fix. I haven't gotten all the way through it. I know the frameworks. We've had a lot of conversations. It's building upon previous work. So it actually is kind of nice because I can kind of then be a liaison for somebody maybe watching and listening, the fourth person in this conversation. I can maybe ask the questions and frame the conversation in ways that they can't because they're not here with us. But I don't know all of it either. So I have some questions about how this all comes through. So today I thought what we could talk about is, let's talk a little bit about the framework of what Neil Howe brought. I think it would be great if you could just explain generational theory framework in a minute here, like for 4-minute explanation. So somebody that didn't watch the other shows, doesn't know what we're talking about, has a quick framework for it. That I think would be really interesting to start to find maybe some of the application in this. We talked about theory, but what's the through line? Where do we have access as generations? I have a different generation than you, Christian.
Yep.
We come from 2 different generations. What's like the actions I can do? What can actually, it's just an exercise and, well, that's interesting. Generations, cool. Or is there something that we can use in our lives and understanding around it?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to break down here. I mean, this is the book, The Fourth Turning is Here. And Neil Howe and William Strauss did a ton of research over decades at this point where they weren't even looking into this. And some of my favorite theories or models have come from that. I think the Graves model was kind of that idea. He was just doing general research and then the model formed. It's almost like you just discovered it. And I think that's the case here with generational theory. They just discovered this pattern. And it's been a pattern over many, many centuries at this point, going back to the 1500s. Specifically, they reference Anglo-American history, but it's referencing all sorts of different experiences all at the same time. And one of the biggest ways that I started to think about this and ways that I can understand the framework itself is that it's a shift in mindset from a linear thinking around time to a cyclical or circular relationship to time. And they use the word saeculum. I forget the full explanation of what it means. The word saeculum actually means, but think of it as cycle. And saeculum lasts an 80 to 100 year cycle of kind of think of it as like an era change. If you think of everything before World War II, it feels like a completely different world.
Yeah.
And before that was the Civil War, which was a completely different world. Before that, I believe it was the American Revolution, completely different world, right? So it's sort of tracking these different worlds and these different eras that change in human history. Because after 80 years, people who fought in that last big war are now either settling to a degree that they don't have interaction with the world, or they're literally dying off and moving on. And who's left behind are the generations that are left with our ideals and figuring things out. So we've got this 80 to 100 year cycle that we're towards the end of, and that's what the fourth turning is referencing. So I'll get into that in a second. So the four turnings essentially are, go ahead and grab that. Sorry. Yeah. I keep slapping it, right? So it's just a nervous tick. So we've got, if you take the 80-year cycle and you break it into four, you've got these 4 seasons, which essentially amount to what is called a generation. You've got 20 years that fit a generational tone of sorts. And the generational tone is usually marked by something that starts the generation and something that ends it. It's where you've got this big 80-year cycle that changes the whole sort of tone of the world itself in a sense. You've got these generational seasons that change the tone within that world.
Yeah.
Right.
80 years is roughly about the average lifespan of a person that you talked about. Like we kind of have that framework. I mean, some people live a less, some people more, but it's like the average-ish age of a person's life. So that kind of makes sense. And then there's, if you think about it, there's kind of also 4 like seasons of my life too. Like I've got up until 20 years old, I'm like a young kid and a teenager. I'm trying to figure stuff out. Between 20 and 40, that's like a young adult season of life. I'm figuring things out. Then between 40 and 60, it's like a midlife. And then 60 plus, 60 to 80 and beyond is like elderhood. And I'm figuring out like my legacy and what my life meant. And think about like passing the torch to the next generation, that kind of thing.
Right. And each of these generations of people that are living during these different time periods bring a different tone. You've got, people living in childhood, people living in young adulthood, people living in midlife, people living in elderhood. And those generations kind of based on their programming, their life experience, all of those elements that it's almost like the alchemical reaction of those things create this tone, plus the circumstances of life. So post World War II, for example, we started getting into the high, or what we call generational spring. That is the first era in this 4 turning framework. And that's post-war. Everything's being reconstructed. Everything's exciting. Like, it's like you survive this massive thing. And there's this fervor and excitement for what the future holds, and building institutions and all this novelty of invention. And a lot of things are really coalescing together. After that 20-year cycle, you then get into what is called the awakening, which is an opportunity for, it's almost like this settling in process. Now that everything has been built, it's like, let's have some fun and loosen up in this territory. It's like summer. You're going to the beach. You're not working a lot. You're taking vacations. It's sort of that general tone of what's going on in the country. And then you get into this next 20-year cycle, which is the unraveling, which is this decreased demand for order, because that's part of what the first 2 brought, was like having civil order. And then the desire for order starts to break down. And then also actually the order starts to break down because we get too comfortable, and the alchemical reaction of the new generations that come in start to shift and change. And so things start to unravel. And then now we're in this winter season, which is more of this, what is called the crisis time period, where we've got a continued seemingly downward slope of loosening the reins on, all of our, we've got these desires that we've been clinging to. The older generations are clinging to more conservative values. And then you've got younger generations looking for a new world in a new way because they've only experienced unraveling. They've only experienced this sort of tension time period of crisis. And we're kind of in that tension time period of crisis. So in those previous podcasts, we kind of go into the details of what those mean relative to our experiences as like boomers and Gen Xers and millennials and Gen Z. And the book goes into so much like detail that my 10-year-old SI introverted sensing memory is like in awe of all of the details in this book. But I think that's the general gist of the framework. And then each generation that's born in that time period, for the boomers, it was 1945 to around 1960. That's the cohort that was born around that time period. They're referred to as the prophet generation, as in prophetic, as in visionary, as in casting values, and they have a lot of desire to build culture.
Yeah.
Because they grew up in a time period where the institutions were pretty settled. And so what they have to do is now they can focus on culture. You've got Gen X that were born around 1961-ish to 1981-ish. And that was the generation that was the latchkey kids. And while the boomers were getting older and going to these awakening, like spiritual retreats and stuff like that, and including their parents, the silent generation, we're starting to like now loosen up and go do those things. Like, I've been such a good citizen my whole life, and now I get to like loosen up. That's what I mean by that summer time period. But Gen Xers being born in the summer is like, well, there's nobody here to take care of me. Everyone's out doing stuff. And that has an implication on that generation born in that time period. Same thing with millennials, 1982-ish to I think a question mark, maybe 2008, 2005-ish, something like that. And very much born in a time period where if the unraveling is starting to happen, you get this notion that everyone's starting to buck up a little bit. There's this focus on children all of a sudden again, and baby on board signs and books more coming out around kids, or, desperately putting children into like religious institutions, and sometimes cults or religious cults and things like that, to try to provide the best opportunity for kids, especially in response to Gen Xers who are out in the streets causing madness. Right. And then you've got Gen Z, 2008 to question mark ish right now too, that is very much being born into this time period that is very overprotective. Like, I was just going for a walk this morning, and I was like, there are very few times these days where I just hear children playing. Mm-hmm. It's like, there's just like this anxiety and tension that even though we're in this like beautiful neighborhood where I don't get the sense that there's any danger here at all, there's still, I don't see kids anywhere.
Yeah.
It's like this overprotected time period, and they're learning to be little polite children. And they have to go inside while we're podcasting, like stuff like that. And it's like, we're working, step aside, or there's a crisis coming. The adults need to do the work. You need to be obedient and behave and all of that stuff. So that's the general framework, and that's the general idea of what those archetypes are like. Did I do that okay?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that's more than the general gist.
Well, okay, great. And I would say that a lot of people have a lot of different theories on, I think we all kind of have some common language about the generational cohorts. Like, most people say they call it Gen X. Most people call it millennials, and most people call them boomers. Mm-hmm. Gen Z is a little different. There's like Gen Y, Gen Z. I think Howe and Strauss originally labeled them the Homelander generation.
I've also heard iGen,
like right?
iPads and iPhones.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of different kind of labels, and I think there's also a lot of different dates of when generations were born or not, and there's kind of a media narrative that often flows. But I'll say, if you're listening or watching along, the Wikipedia article on this, the specific Strauss and Howe's theory, Wikipedia doesn't do a heavy lift on a lot of things, but they certainly do a really heavy lift on this. So just the Wikipedia article around this, I mean, they coined the term millennial with their book Millennials Rising, I think back in the 90s.
Yeah.
That's where we got the word, is from these guys and their work. And so they put a lot of effort into finding the pattern of when the generational cohorts start, the dates. I trust their dates better than any other media narrative, is what I'm trying to say.
Yep.
I think they sync up well, and I think they make sense, and they've got a good reason for it. And they've gone all the way back to like the 1500s.
Yeah.
And now it's American centric, because they just had to focus. They wanted to take a pristine continent that didn't have an old world to take into account.
Right.
He talks about it in the book, the part I've gotten through. And he talks a little bit about how that was a great focal point, because if you had to take the world into account, you've got a lot of old legacy things from like Europe, Asia, other places. There's been humanity, there's civilization for so long. It's hard to see like a clean snapshot. So the United States gives a very unique perspective to generational cycles. And so starting there, that's probably why they focus on it. But I think it's still very informative to us to see a cadence of generational cohorts developing.
Well, and even then we kind of see the world is the reason that we get these like crisis time periods, these total wars. For example, with the American Revolution, you've got the Civil War, you've got World War II, getting into more world-centric, connective countries and things like that. So there's almost this, at times, calibrative process that these different total wars provide these moments for things to sync up. So other countries seem to sync up with America's story or be out of sync. And that is what brings some of the conflict sometimes. And I think one of the reasons we wanted to talk about this is that if someone's into this theory and they understand, or even if you are just learning about this for the first time and have gone back to a couple episodes and you're starting to go down the rabbit hole, you'll start to realize that there's patterns that this book does a better job of starting to explain almost where we are at relative to like pre-World War II.
Yeah.
Like seeing the parallel of, you can almost put a date on it that we're like kind of in the early 30s, late 20s right now in terms of that.
Of the last
last saculum. And and how that started to culminate. We can learn lessons from that for how we can navigate in the world going forward. And I think there's a lot of natural, like I said, about being overprotected with kids and the anxiety. There's a general sense that there's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of concerns. There's people doing polls and saying like, yes, I think there will be a civil war and stuff like that. So I'm not talking in any sort of conspiratorial way. I think people can feel that in their daily lives. And I think this provides, strangely, a lot more comfort as to what's going to come, because this provided a framework for me to understand that there's almost like he used the word constellation, that there's a constellation point where each generation, like we've got the Homelander Gen Z generation in childhood right now. We've got millennials in young adulthood and almost to the point of owning that time period. Gen X, midlife, and then boomers and elderhood. And we're like a few years away from each of those generations like fully owning that phase of life.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm 37. I think around like 41, 42, that's full on midlife. And my oldest generational brethren is like right on the doorstep. And the best, clearest example of this is the military. The military has a cutoff. I don't remember the exact age. I think it's 63 or 65, where the eldest generational leaders, the military leaders, the generals, are going to retire. The boomers are going to retire, and Gen X is going to literally take over the military.
Yeah.
And that changes the tone of the world. That changes the tone of the country for different generations to step into these different roles, for better or worse.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that was a really good point that was made in the book, that we're not just on the receiving end of the influences of generations. We also, as generations, we influence the culture. It's like a back and forth. And that concept of the constellations, I think one of the most powerful, if we're trying to find a through line of like practicality, or why would we even talk about this other than just intuitive porn or whatever, is, oh, look, it's another cool system.
Yep.
There's the, like you said, after reading the book, I feel better about where we're headed into the future.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say that there's not like potentially really big stuff coming up that needs to be accounted for. But it gave me a renewed appreciation for all of these generations and the constellations, that they all have a part to play.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we can keep our finger on the pulse of that and not allow, because if you allow the media to do so, they will ensure that all of us are as divided as humanly possible, that we're at each other's throats in every way that you can split a demographic, and that includes generationally. And so what I love about the concept of generational theory is that each of the generations, so like you mentioned, there's 4 generational archetypes. And those 4 generational archetypes keep coming up over and over. The prophets that are currently represented by boomers, the nomads, which are currently represented by Gen X, the hero generation, which is currently represented by millennials, and the artist generation, which is actually like sort of the bookends right now, which are the silent generation, right? Which is the generation that preceded the boomers. And then the up and coming Gen Z or iGen or Homeland or whatever you want to call them. And they're sort of our bookends right now. And the artist generation, they're the ones who, like you mentioned, are children, or excuse me, they're the ones that are children during a crisis. And that means that when the crisis is complete, when winter is over and spring starts, and that's when the prophets start to be born, it's really that artist generation that sort of sets a tone and carries the values of that saeculum through, right? Like they're the ones who almost are trendsetters of the value of the next 80 years.
Right. Like, for example, the greatest generation, the GI generation,
Mhm.
which stands for general issue,
Yeah.
which is funny on
Yeah.
its own.
Yeah.
Like, they were very compliant, civil
Mhm.
focused generation. And that, I think that's what millennials are desiring to be.
hmm
They built the institutions
That's right.
that we've been experiencing over these last 80 years.
That's right.
And then the artist generation, the silent generation,
Yeah.
carried those through
They're the
this
torchbearers all the way through.
to the point where we've got we have an artist generation, the only artist generation president as of this recording,
That's right.
who is still holding that torch.
That's right. The only silent generation specifically of the artist. Yeah.
Correct.
Exactly. And so actually it surprisingly we have a lot of elderhood representatives in our government, right? The Speaker of the House, like many senators, like there's a lot that are still part of that silent generation.
Well, she's no longer Speaker of the House now.
Oh,
Time of this recording. But
sorry.
she was.
She was
You're talking about
up-
Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah, up until
And
very
you're talking
recently.
about Biden,
Right.
President Biden.
Yes.
Both of them are from that silent
That's
generation
right.
in the early 1940s. So
That's
that
right.
archetypical energy of the artist.
And
Yes.
they're carrying a certain energy that was really important in the last saeculum, but that's going to become complete. And then that same almost missive will be carried out by Gen Z into the next generation, right?
Mhm.
And it's like a handoff. And right now you can see why it would be kind of a complicated cultural storm that we're experiencing, because we still have a lot of that previous artist generation whose job it was to be the torchbearers of the previous values, that they're not retired yet, right?
Mhm.
They're still there, and it still feels like it's their job to bear that sort of like, make sure that those saeculum values are represented, but that's going to become complete very soon, and
Mhm.
time all by itself will retire that voice.
They're like, we'll die before we retire.
Yeah.
We'll
Yeah.
die first.
And that might end up
Like,
happening.
They're in their 80s
and
now, like mid 80s.
Mhm.
It's
Right.
crazy.
But what that told me is that that's an important position. Like that's an important archetypal energy that our children, right? Because at least 2 of our 3 children are going to be artists, most likely. That our children will be doing the same thing for the next saeculum.
Mhm.
And so that's an important role that it's easy for me to like have a little bit of piss and vinegar about. Like, come on, guys, why aren't you like what's going on? Like,
Mhm.
but it's like that's what they did. That was their job, and they're still doing it as long as they're alive.
Right.
And then you've got it's really easy to crap on boomers. I don't know why we've all taken to that.
Mhm.
But to some extent, their job as prophets is starting to become like they're going to have a bit of their say in how the next saeculum gets set up, but probably a more muted voice, because their time of real cultural influence is during, like you said, summer. It's in
Mhm.
that awakening, that spiritual awakening.
Mhm.
Gen X, fascinatingly enough, you don't really hear about Gen X much, but during the crisis is their time to shine. Like
Mhm.
they start stepping up and becoming the generals and becoming the leaders and
Mhm.
becoming the people who are just like they're practical, gritty. You used to being ignored, but I guess if nobody else is doing it, I have to do
Well,
it sort of feel.
Mhm.
It's fixing the VCR for our parents
You
writ
got it.
large.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
Like, can you program the VCR?
Yeah, well-
and that was the generation thing that, that's like a trope, but it was literal
You
too.
got it.
Yeah.
How many extras walked into the living room to see their parents suffering over the VCR, trying to like get the clock to stop flashing 12, right? Over and over and over. And they're just like, all right, get out of the way. I'll fix it for you, right?
I'm gonna have to put a clip of what a VCR is for
A
some,
Yeah,
VCR
for anybody
for-
that's
some
under
of
the
our
age of
younger
30, like,
listeners.
what's a VCR?
But all the extras know, right? We
Mhm.
all know. And so, yeah, exactly.
It
My
stands for
goodness.
video cassette recorder.
I can't
I
believe
was
anybody
actually
wouldn't
had to
know what a VCR
about
is,
that,
but
yeah.
yes. And so it's that kind of like you walk in and you're like, what? Nobody can do this? All right, get out of the way, I'll do it. And there's a practicality to the Gen X
Mhm.
ethos that's gonna become really super important. And of course, obviously the hero generation. Millennials now, what word the GI version earlier, they're the ones who fight the war, right? Like the
Mhm.
hero generation. I mean, like, as soon as I read generational theory, I was like, oh, this is why we can't stop having superhero movies,
Mhm.
right? It's like, we can't stop. Why? Because there's a generation of heroes that are prepping themselves mentally and emotionally for whatever's coming next.
And
Every-
guess when the last time this was? 1930s,
Mm-hmm.
right before World War II.
Right.
Like the last hero generation.
And a ton.
Batman, Spider-Man,
That's right. Instead of
Superman.
comic books.
Yep.
Comic books were huge back then. Superheroes were huge right before War of the Worlds. Remember Orson Welles' thing came out? Like these ideas like alien invading. We got to be heroes to save the planet, save the world from some invader
this
type of energy.
threat.
Yes.
Yep. And it's easy when you're not of a generation to kind of get irritated by some of the characteristics. But like you mentioned, this constellation of archetypal energies, they're all necessary and needed. And if we can cooperate, if we can understand where we all come in, as opposed to allowing ourselves to be divided, that all by itself was worth the book for me. Is to go stop. Why am I crapping on people of other generations? Like, just because they're different than me? Like, why am I doing that? It's the same. It's basically the same thing as type, right? It's like when you first learn type, maybe you get a little salty about other types, right? I don't like this type, and that's why blah blah blah. And like I got into type so I could talk to them because they really irritate me. You get far enough into type theory, pretty soon you're like, oh my gosh, all the types are needed, right? And I'm just being a jerk, right?
I'm only like chapter 4.5 ish on this particular book. He's dabbled a little bit, but he talks about personality types. He talks about Jungian like ideas. He talks about personality types, the Myers-Briggs system. Is there more coming, or is it just a quick like reference early in the book? And I'm not going to find. And why does he do this?
I think in this book, there's a couple of charts that really look at how you take a couple different archetypes. I mean, you think of temperaments; those are kind of archetypes, right?
Yeah.
Take the archetypes of prophet and like NF archetype, the NF temperament, and he applies a couple of them together to almost demonstrate how like the core values of what the generation actually is. Like boomers, the prophet generation really cares about culture and values. They're always against the government. Even when Donald Trump was in the presidency, he was always fighting against his own presidency. He's still fighting against the system, right? Fighting against the status quo, and just continuing to do that. It's about values.
Well, and Xers are probably very NT. I mean, if you did temperaments, I could already kind of start to see a thing.
Well, I know what he said. I can say
what did he say? Because I'm thinking NT for
NF
Gen X.
for boomers.
Okay.
SJ for Gen X.
Really?
Oh
man.
Censor
That's
judger.
disappointing. That's not the idealism I wanted to
but
hear.
it's very practical. Very practical.
SJ, because I wanted it to be like, I don't know.
You want it to be more
like get to the moon or something like
more
it
like
seems
you.
like the
more
end.
ambitious.
Even though I'm not an NT, I feel like that's building tech companies, scaling, figuring out how to like use leveraged code. I'm sure I want to believe it was a Gen Xer that invented the blockchain. Like that's what I want to believe, even if it's not true.
Right.
Like that's what I want to believe. Like we figured out like code and hacking and figuring, like we call this personality hacker. Like it's a Gen X ethos, right?
Right.
But I could see SJ kind of being the responsible, buckle down, build the bridges, do what it takes.
Practical.
Like
Exactly.
get the things done. Like come on. We got to get rid of idealism, but get real down to earth.
Well, you're also on the later half of Gen X. You're a little closer to the hero archetype. I think there's and you're an ENFP. Like there's those things still come into play, of course.
And I just want to make a comment. You're not disappointed because you don't like SJ things.
No, well, no, not at all. It's just that's not my mindset. Like I don't think about SJ things. Like, that's not where I want to be attuned.
It's like when someone takes a test and they find out they're like an INFJ and they're like, I wanted to be an ESTP or something like that,
exactly.
Right? It's just, we all have our things that we actually want to be.
It sounds responsible. It doesn't sound fun.
Right.
Like responsible. I'm sorry, SJs, but you sound responsible.
Well,
you sound like responsible people.
Sorry, Joel. You're a professional now.
Yeah.
You're responsible.
So what does he characterize for millennials?
Millennials are NT.
Okay.
Intuitive thinking.
So that's where all these like labels and like all the particular like
it's all focused on
you're this and this and like
psychology, big picture thinking about the future, a lot of invention, and future forecasting, and really being judgmental of SJ things, being judgmental of more of the censor judger parts of life. The Gen Z, the Homelanders, the iGen, I'll use all the terms. Why not?
The artists,
SP. And, you could probably try to get into and try to apply a type to the current generations because it's really the temperaments are fitting the archetypes of sorts. And, postulate in the comments. I think that'd be fun, but don't take it too seriously. Don't fight each other. SP, sensor perceiver, right? And they're just much more, they have to be in the moment because they're just they're buckled down. They're having to be at home all the time, and it's adapting to their environment and adapting to their situation.
Yeah, like when you're not in school for 2 years for a pandemic, you're kind of in a hunter-gatherer mode. Like you're kind
Yes.
of in this like, I just got to respond to the environment. What's going on today? Am I going back to school yet? Is everything back opened up?
Mhm.
I mean, that's just it's only 2 years of a person's life, but it's a good way to look at it, like a lens to look through of what kind of the pandemic brought forward is like writ large. Like, okay, that's kind of in a snapshot of their generation, what they're dealing with. They kind of institutions are breaking down. They have to kind of
Yeah.
figure it out. They
Well,
got to be responsive to the moment.
and
Right.
that's a precursor, right, to what, according to generational theory, there's a crisis coming, right? I mean, it might feel like we're already in it, but every saculum completes in what they call total
Oh,
war.
I'm sure in
And so,
1938, it felt like we're already in a crisis, Great Depression, and then
Yeah.
World War II hits. It's like, how
Yep.
worse could it get?
Pearl
It
Harbor
gets
and
way
all-
worse. Yeah.
Mhm.
exactly. And so there's whatever is happening to our kids now is going to happen even more,
Mhm.
right? And how we respond to it. He's basically like, I don't think that he speaks in like doom and gloom, fatalistic inevitability, it's all going to be bad, but he definitely indicates that there are cycles, and these cycles are very predictable. And the predictable cycle is that we're entering a time period of a crisis that is going to require sacrifice. That's what like that was the number one word I got from the book, was that we're going to experience sacrifice in a way that we've never really experienced before in our lifetime. And our kids are going to have to be responsive to the levels of sacrifice that are asked of us. Now, not every single person will be asked to sacrifice at that level. You know, we've talked about how during the Civil War, there were people who sacrificed everything. And it was, I mean, like it massively, radically altered every aspect of their life. And then there were other people who were getting letters about it. Right.
Mhm.
And so there's always that piece. Like, who knows who's going to be asked to sacrifice? Who knows which pockets of our demographic are going to be hit the most and which ones are not? But you can tell that it's coming up. And and so that constellation of generations, it's like, can we prepare to understand what our place in all of this is going to be, so that
Yeah.
if we're asked to sacrifice, we understand that it's, you know, like not every crisis ends up becoming something that destroys everything. In fact, like the last few cycles in America, our saculums have ended in terrible circumstances that galvanized the communities and the cultures, and we
Mhm.
came out stronger on the other side. That's not to say that that's inevitable, right? Like sometimes the total wars end up in a saculum of an 80-year experience that is not fun for anybody.
Mhm.
But we've actually, almost every single saculum, somehow we've gotten on the other side and been stronger on the other side. And so that's entirely possible.
Mhm.
It's just how we treat our crisis. It's not whether or not there's going to be one. We can't prevent it, but how do we respond to it? And how we respond is really important for setting the values of the next 80 years. And you can almost feel it. I almost feel like this hungry, hungry hippo energy of who's going to be able to set the values of the next saculum.
Yeah.
And I kind of feel like whatever is asked from us is going to shake things up so much that whatever we're fighting about right now is probably not going to matter that much.
No.
That's my guess.
No, not at all. I think it's really interesting to think about this constellation idea. The constellation forms, it's like a unity point, a moment where like the stars are already moving. Like
Mhm.
everything's already in motion,
Mhm.
meaning that the things that we're doing in our everyday lives are going to amount to that. Like, for example, you mentioned the media earlier. Like when I come over here, you guys talk about the media way more than I ever care about it.
Yeah.
But you know, media and communication, because if you're going to be the generals,
Ah,
especially
interesting.
in a really world centric time period where there's mass communication, and it's not like you're just going to the local town hall and wrangling people, but like
Yeah.
you have community. Personality Hacker is a community that you are the leaders of, and learning over time, like where are you leading people to and how can you guide them. Now in this case, you're usually leading people through something like Personality Life Path to be able to bring bring their best selves to their lives and their situation.
Yeah.
I think that's a version of that, but it's very much like been this path of developing your relationship to media and communication, and therefore being judgmental about the mass media who's lying to people or misleading people or not communicating effectively, not being good leaders. like, because that is built in you, you're developing those skills to be able to reach as many people as possible, to bring that SJ ethos, to bring that practicality, to, you know, to when the crisis hits, like, that's going to be the thing you really care about.
And I just
yeah.
I just realized, and we too, I don't know if I could hate the media more, but part of that SJ ethos, if you translate it into cognitive function terms, and I have gotten such a profound appreciation for the cognitive function of introverted sensing or memory, like beyond what I ever thought before, because I was your typical stereotypical ENTP who was like, my fourth function, that's not necessary, right? It's all boring, blah blah blah. But part of introverted sensing or the memory function is knowing what is important to keep. Like, what are the traditions? What are the things that we've come from that are super important to not forget? And it does feel like other generations around me play fast and loose with that. They're way more cavalier about just throwing out the history in the past and like, let's just burn it all down and start over. And I'm like,
okay,
with what model? Like, burn it all down, and then you set up what?
I see it now. Okay.
You know what I mean? And so like, I feel like
I feel the same way.
like a deep bone level need to remember important things from previous, from the past and previous generations, and ensure that those things get handed over to like the next iteration. It's so important to me. And to me, it feels like, like things like the media, like it feels like the media will do anything for a buck, including destroy everything.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm like, you're trying to destroy everything because you're trying to get clicks. Really? Is that the noblest thing you could be doing? And you're and creating all this division. We need introverted sensing's concepts of interoperability, right? Like, we need standards, we need interoperability, we need to carry something into the next phase.
Yep.
And that's so important to me. And I could see that being like a generational missive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the older generations tend to represent more of like the retaining of conservative values, sometimes politically, but not necessarily always. It's just the general notion of
what to conserve, right?
Like, what do we need to be resilient around and hold on to? And I think the younger generation, like, I got this sense, I think he said it in the book, or maybe he said it on one of his interviews that I watched on YouTube, Neil Howe. He referenced that millennials feel this sense of like being born into a world that they don't belong to.
Right.
And that's why we have this ambition towards redefining institutions, trying to figure out what the world's going to look like next, and such a willingness to abandon a lot of things, especially when you're starting to look through history and cherry picking things that don't fit the values that you want to take forward with you. Yeah. So there's more of this like conservative progressive split by trend of younger versus older. And it also represents to me this sensitivity and resilience that are these extremes that are not healthy in an individual person to withhold for too long. You need this concept of antifragility, which I think is the most unfortunate name. I think there's a better name there, but it's this like union of sensitivity and resilience. It's like
yet another anti-word.
Yet another anti-word. Like, we don't need more of that.
Anti-everything.
Yeah.
Right. But if you've got like Gen X and millennial kind of at the middle, and I was born in 1985, I'm like quite literally in the middle.
Yeah.
There is this sense of trying to unify these ideas to like transcend into something that's this like resilience without losing sensitivity, and sensitivity without losing resilience and toughness. So it's like Gen Xers encouraging millennials to toughen up a little bit and focus on something, and millennials encouraging Gen Xers to like loosen up, and you don't have to push yourself into the ground all the time. Right. So it's like there's definitely encouragement from both sides to be able to find a better balance. And then once that union sort of forms of these archetypes, this constellation, then it creates this almost like Power Rangers like laser beam that focuses on whatever the quote unquote enemy ends up becoming.
So let me see if I can put some tangibility to what you're saying. When you say constellation, you say things are kind of moving, like they're already starting to drift, almost like continents drifting.
Yes.
For this like action that's going to come, or this event horizon that's coming toward us imminently.
Yeah.
Something, for example, let's say, I mean, it could be political, it could be cultural, but let me just pick an economic situation. The last time there was a switch in a big economic way was in World War II, at the end of World War II.
Yep.
most of the world was on what's called a reserve currency, and it was focused around the pound sterling, which was silver. The British pound was backed by silver. After World War II, the devastation of Europe and all the heavy lift of Europe having to rebuild, which has basically taken like the last 60 to 80 years to like build everything back up to where it once was, because it was devastating.
Yeah.
We switched from the pound sterling as being the reserve currency in the world to the US dollar.
Yep.
And the gold that backed the US dollar. Now, Nixon changed that in 71 when he went off the gold standard, and that caused a whole nother petrodollar situation, which I'm not going to get into. But the point is, we had a moment where we switched from the pound sterling to the dollar. And that constellational drift right now, I hear about the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, South Africa, China, like some of these countries are coming together and they're saying, we don't want the United States dollar, petrodollar, to be the reserve currency of the world. We want to maybe move to the digital yen or something on the blockchain, something that's not, and we're going to back it with gold from South Africa and all our countries, accumulating gold to back it as a real, financial backing. But we're going to, we want to switch currencies is what their intention is. Now that can't happen yet because the US dollar is so powerful.
Right.
But a major crisis, a major war would, the constellational drift would make that click and make that happen, most likely. Some kind of a crash, whether it's a market crash or a total war or some major conflict. And we have a conflict at the time of this recording happening in Europe right now. So all basically what I hear you saying is like constellations are starting to drift and all the ingredients start to like be put on the table.
It's like a
whatever's
scramble.
coming.
It's like the lava starts coming out of the cracks.
And we could almost feel it building. Like it probably, if we were alive in the 1930s and we were aware of these patterns, we'd be having a very similar conversation. Like there's a Great Depression and there's a Dust Bowl and out in the West here in the United States, and Europe's kind of getting in this powder keg. They're resentful of World War I. And it's like things are starting to build and there's like conflict just brewing, and then boom, powder keg hits.
And I think there's an element of thinking about my generation and younger, focusing on progressive, like wanting to make new territory, that we're missing the fact often that in order to create new land or new life, you have to burn a lot of territory. And we're thinking about burning institutions, quote unquote, but like in order to make certain types of progress, like a lot of things are like, there's going to be sacrifice. Like you're saying, there's going to be a lot of hurt, going to be a lot of grief, a lot of frustration, a lot of searching for meaning and purpose. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this, is because I suspect, and I've read about this idea of the meaning crisis. You can refer to it as introverted intuition perspectives in the Myers-Briggs sense of like, we don't really have a clear sense of what the future is. Like you think about the 80s and you have this idea of like, you can get a job, you can do X, Y, and Z. Right now, there's a lot of question marks about what the future is. And this constellation point, this total war, creates the opportunity for almost a singularity. Like introverted intuition loves singularities, right? And that's kind of what this all feels like. It's a constellation. It's a singularity of sorts. But when that singularity point hits, it's not as if it's like the end of the world, which is what it feels like, or has been communicated that it feels like for a lot of people, things like global warming and stuff like that. But it's an opportunity for all of the energies that are on the table to collide. And now like new life or new emergence or new possibilities will spring forth from that. And that to me is the optimism that I think comes from this, that even though we go through a tough time, we are both building the skills now to be able to go through that tough time, which I do want to talk about as we get into the third act of this podcast, and talk about the practical stuff that each generation is doing. Like we mentioned, media and communication for Gen X, that we're all building towards this skill, and then coming out of it, how does that skill translate into the next phases of life, getting back into the next high? And this book covers so much detail that to get into all of that would be unnecessary.
Of course.
But, essentially, if I can get into it,
let's go.
I can talk about what I perceive. I don't know that he actually said this in the book, so this is a little bit of my speculating.
We're going to extrapolate here.
Christian's
going on extrapolation any run.
Yes.
Intuition.
I should start a podcast
Neil
called
Howe.
Extrapolation Nation.
That's right. Neil Howe, if you're watching, we don't believe that we're quoting you directly.
Neil, if
I'm
you're
not
watching,
sure.
please come on the show and talk with us directly.
That would be
Neil.
amazing.
Wouldn't
Actually,
that be cool?
He's promoting the book. It might be an
lives in
opportunity.
DC. Was he 90 minutes away
It
from us?
might be a possibility.
Maybe we could figure it out.
He's
Get
on
out
the
of
bucket
DC.
list.
Right. So we talked about media and communication.
Sure.
Gen Xers, cobbling stuff together, trying to make things work, trying to be the fixer. I think Neil Howe said that Gen X is like the fixer generation. There was this one YouTube video I saw of someone explaining generational theory. He was a Gen Xer, and by the end, he was like, he felt this sense of purpose. Like there's a there's a park down the street that has a broken swing, and he's like, I'm a fixer, I'm a mechanic. And like afterwards, he grabbed his tools and he went and he's like, let me go fix that. And it's such a minor example, but like we're working on a lot of inner work things to help people calibrate to live their best life, find a sense of meaning and purpose.
Yeah.
And that to me is like fixing, not in the sense that people are broken, whatever.
But or hacking though,
or
helping them hack a better way.
Hack a better way, hacking your life, to find a shortcut or a warp whistle if you're a Super Mario Brothers fan, And so I think each generation has a version of what they're preparing to do.
Sure.
Okay, so I want to put a pause in this conversation, Antonia, just for a moment and actually split this episode. We had a long conversation with Christian, and in the next segment, we're going to get into some of the practical things around generations that we talked about at the very beginning of the show. So before we get into that, and it doesn't end up as like a 2-hour conversation, we thought we'd split this into 2 parts, put a pause in this, and in the next episode, we'll pick back up in the conversation with Christian and Antonia and myself, and we'll go into some of the practical applications that we see around generations, maybe some access points for you in your generational cohort to get involved in, growing your generational ideas, figuring out what kind of opportunities are for you in your cohort. So what you can do right now, though, in the meantime, is come over and make your voice heard. There were 3 of us in this conversation. You're the 4th person. You weren't able to be here with a microphone, but we do want to hear from you. Head over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, you can leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your story. Again, stories are compressed experiences. They let us know where you're coming from, what's going on in your life, and we get to vicariously live through your experiences by the stories you share with us. So again, come over to personalityhacker.com and make your voice heard.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on on iTunes, it helps us out a lot. You might be watching this on YouTube as a video podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe, and hit the little bell that lets you know when a new episode comes out. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. And make sure that you tune in for episode number 2 of this 2-part generational podcast, because I think you're going to really appreciate some of the information we go over with Christian Rivera about the practical applications and some of the things that you can do for your generational archetype.
Yeah, my name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.
Hey, it's Joel from Personality Hacker. So a big reason people get into personality types is usually to improve their relationships with other people. And you can understand key differences between you and someone else when you understand how type works. So clearly, personality type is applied to relationships. But what about the relationship with yourself? Well, personality type can also help you navigate your career, or maybe an educational path that you need to follow, or other opportunities that present themselves, and it helps you know which are the right choice for you. And ultimately, personality is the key to unlocking identity-level worldview and life purpose. It all starts with getting the owner's manual for your personality type. In this owner's manual, we cover the basics of your personality. And then we dive a layer deeper to connect your personality to your relationships, your career, your worldview, and identity. Because we believe it's your life, and it should be designed for your personality. So start your owner's manual journey at personalityhacker.com. When you access your owner's manual, I recommend focusing on the ideal day exercise first, because when you start crafting your ideal day, you're being mindful about the type of lifestyle that you want. So designing a life around how you're naturally wired makes sense, and you can finally stop fighting yourself. So come discover and develop your unique personality at personalityhacker.com.